There are pages in history that aren't written in ink, but soaked in blood. One such page tells the story of a secret operation where a life was measured in test results, where human suffering became no more than data, and humans themselves no more than brainless logs. My name's Autumn. Join me as I walk you through the horrifying truth of the infamous Unit 731.
Viewers' discretion is advised. The themes discussed in this video may be too much for younger viewers.
Before we can even begin to understand how something like Unit 731 was allowed to happen, we have to look at where it came from. We have to go back to a time when Japan was completely shut off from the rest of the world. From the early 1600s to the mid-1800s, Japan was ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate. This was a military government that deliberately sealed off the country from foreign influence. This policy was known as Sakoku, meaning literally closed country. During this time, the Christian missionaries were expelled. Foreign trade was limited to only a single port in Nagasaki, and even that was heavily monitored and only open to the Dutch. No one in, no one out. Japan was locked down tightly. This isolation lasted over 200 years. But in 1853, everything changed. That year, U.S. Commodore Matthew Perry sailed into Edo Bay with black steam-powered warships. Upon arriving on Japan's shore, what they saw was a nation unmarked by modernity. There was no hum of industry, no sparks of electricity, only the hush of a world untouched by machines. Timbered villages, quiet footpaths, and a rigid order where every person knew their place. Carrying word from U.S. President Millard Fillmore, America demanded that Japan open up its ports to Western trade. Due to Japan's intense period of isolation, progress in the country was mostly halted in the name of conservation and tradition. Due to this, many Western powers viewed Japan as dangerously behind in many departments, economically, militarily, education-wise, and industrially. Because of this, in many ways, Japan was caught off guard by America's military arrival and stark demands. I mean, think about it. After centuries of pure isolation, they found themselves staring at 4 US warships that had just waltzed up to their shore, with all of the US government's military might on full display. Though these ships never fired a shot during this forced exchange, Commodore Matthew Perry's expedition carried a very clear threat of violence. This tactic was known as gunboat diplomacy. With practically no other choice, a year later, Japan signed the Treaty of Kanagawa. And just like that, currently unable to fight against the West, their doors were forcibly blown open. What quickly followed was the complete top-down restoration of the entire country, known as the Meiji Restoration. Japan had to modernize rapidly. In order to achieve that, practically all government systems were completely overhauled. And Japan started looking west, copying and studying the powers they once shut out. They learned European medicine, adopted Germany's military tactics, built a navy like Britain's. But, as you can imagine, all of that modernization came with something else. An intense hunger for power, retribution, and expansion. In 1905, Japan shocked the world by defeating the Russian Empire in the Russo-Japanese War. This was the first time that an Asian power had beaten a European one. And just as you'd think, this sent shockwaves through the West. 5 years later, Japan annexed Korea. And just like that, it was part of the Imperial Club. But as we discussed earlier, this was not just about land or politics. Japan believed that its destiny was something far greater, scientific, divine even. By the 1920s, many in Japan didn't just see themselves as equal to the West, they saw themselves as superior, especially though to other Asians. Quickly, science started to reflect that belief. Medical research and military ambition began to blur together. Japanese doctors began conducting experiments in occupied territories. At first, small, but it got darker. One such doctor was Shiro Ishii, a young, brilliant microbiologist. He was described as ambitious and charismatic, but as we will soon discuss, he was something else entirely. Barbaric. You see, Ishii believed that science was Japan's divine weapon. And in 1931, he was granted just the excuse he needed to begin using it. That very year, Japan staged the Mukden incident. This was a false flag attack aimed at blaming Chinese saboteurs for a railway explosion. It was all a calculated lie. But as intended, it gave them the cover necessary to invade Manchuria, which for their plan was crucial. Japan then quickly took over the region and created a puppet state called Manchukuo. And it was there, far from oversight, far from any law, that they began building something unspeakable. A place where no rules applied, where prisoners could be dissected, tortured, and disposed of, all under the umbrella of science. In the shadows of occupied Manchuria, under the excuse of public health, something horrifying began to take shape. In 1936, the Japanese Imperial Army set up what they called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department. It sounded harmless. That was the intent, as this was their cover story. Its real name, its real purpose, was only known to a select few. This was Unit 731. And the man in charge? None other than Shiro Ishii. Yes, the same man that spent years convincing the military that biological weapons could be Japan's secret edge. He intrigued many in powerful positions because he promised a new kind of power. Not tanks or bombs, but plague, cholera, and death in the form of chemicals or germs. They built Unit 731 in Pingfeng, right outside of Harbin. 6 square kilometers, which for my fellow Americans is a bit over 2 miles. Over 150 buildings, labs, barracks, power plants, crematoriums, storage facilities, prison cells. It even had its own rail line, its own police force, and a massive incinerator to get rid of evidence. It was an entire city made for one purpose: to learn how to break the human body. Inside, prisoners were called maruta, or logs. They chose this word purposely to strip them of their humanity, because to doctors and guards, these weren't people. They couldn't be people. They were no more than biological matter and material for them to use. Most were Chinese civilians. There were also Koreans, Mongolians, Russians, and even Allied prisoners of war. They were dragged from their homes, from the streets. Sometimes whole families were arrested together. Once inside Unit 731, there were no trials, only death. And Ishii had support from top military brass, other doctors too. They all came together in what became one of the darkest chapters in medical history. What happened inside Unit 731 wasn't random violence. It was controlled and planned. To all who were unaware, the doctors didn't look like the monsters they were. They wore white lab coats, they took notes, they carried clipboards. Yet they tracked every scream, every heartbeat, and every moment of agony. One of the most infamous science experiments often conducted within Unit 731 was known as vivisection. Prisoners were strapped down to metal tables, awake, alert, no anesthesia. Organs were often removed, one by one. Then their bodies were opened. Doctors observed. Some had their stomachs removed and their esophagus sewn directly to their intestines. Please note, when I'm referencing vivisection, these vivisections were performed live. These patients were typically conscious as long as possible, and as I mentioned before, had zero sedation. Some of these people had their brains cut into. Remembering how this was all allegedly in the name of public health and medical discovery, you'd think that their goal would be to learn how to treat things. Please remember, throughout this section, they are not trying to heal anyone. They just wanted to observe. And when disease entered the picture, the cruelty escalated exponentially. Prisoners were deliberately infected with things like typhoid, cholera, syphilis, and even the bubonic plague. They were then dissected at different stages to observe the progression of these various diseases. Which organs failed first? How long did it take them to die? One nurse testifies that a pregnant woman was forcibly infected with syphilis. and then she was dissected alongside her unborn baby. And according to the nurse, the child was still alive when they began. In many wartime scenarios, women, and especially pregnant women, would simply be off limits. But in Unit 731, pregnant women were often targeted. Although guards were strictly prohibited from having intimate contact with female prisoners, many did. Others forced prisoners to have intercourse with each other under threat of death. They did this just to observe disease transmission in the womb. And when babies were born, they were used in experiments as well, or killed, or vivisected. This was generational torture. There were frostbite experiments. Prisoners were marched outside into freezing snow. Water was then poured over their skin until their flesh froze solid. Doctors would then strike the frozen limbs with sticks or boards or batons, listening for the sound of crackling within the flesh. They'd also try different methods to rewarming the limbs. They would try fire, flamethrowers, hot water, bare hands, even scorching oil. They weren't in search of answers, just the reactions. Many prisoners died this way, in slow, excruciating pain. Other prisoners were subject to weapon testing. Prisoners had grenades strapped to their bodies. Others were tied to stakes at different distances. Those who didn't die this way the first time were often used again and again until their bodies were no longer usable. There were prisoners that were locked inside of pressure chambers. The air was slowly removed. First, their eardrums burst. Then their eyes bulged. Eventually, their lungs collapsed. One case describes a man whose chest literally exploded after prolonged decompression. They wanted to simulate high-altitude flight, but instead of mannequins, they used people. There were flame tests, bayonet tests, sword tests, gunshot tests, anything you could think of. Prisoners were set on fire, shot, stabbed. How long until they died of blood loss? It was data. All of it was data. Allegedly, Unit 731 also raised thousands of plague-infested fleas. They loaded them into canisters and dropped them over Chinese towns. This infected entire cities, often on purpose, but sometimes even by mistake. Then researchers would swoop in, dressed as aid workers, just to observe the aftermath. In Ningbo, over 100 people died in one such attack. The mission was labeled a success, but the survivors were then captured and brought in for further study. In the lab, prisoners were made to drink unsanitary water, eat rotten food, inhale pathogens in a sealed room, just to measure how quickly they'd get sick and how quickly they'd succumb to the illness. Some prisoners were denied food and water for weeks. Their starvation, hallucinations, organ failure, and then death were all recorded. Others were even made to drink seawater or animal blood. Speaking of blood, doctors also experimented with blood transfusions. They would swap human blood with sheep blood or horse blood, or they would purposely use the wrong blood types. This would cause shock, seizure, and death. Limbs were amputated and often sewn onto other parts of the body. Prisoners were locked inside of dark rooms with no light or no sound to study their psychological breakdowns. Others were exposed to mustard gas or phosgene, causing blistered skin and collapsed lungs. Every symptom was written down. Some of the worst stories aren't about how people died. They're about how long people were made to live. One prisoner survived multiple surgeries, organ removals, frostbite tests, and infections. They called him resilient, and they kept going until his body finally gave out. No one escaped. No one was released. Almost no one survived. Only a few testimonies remain, mostly from doctors and nurses. This is because the rest, the logs, were incinerated, erased from memory. Now, let's get into the cover-up. In August of 1945, as the tide of World War II turned decisively against Japan, the empire began to crumble. Cities were firebombed, Allies closed in, and then 2 atomic bombs, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Consequently, Japan announced its surrender on August 15th. The war was effectively over, but For those inside Unit 731, the end didn't mean accountability. It meant erasure. As Soviet forces advanced into Manchuria, panic spread like wildfire through the Pingfeng complex. Doctors, guards, and scientists alike scrambled to destroy evidence. Files were burned and bones were crushed. Prisoners, what few were still alive, were immediately executed or even vivisected in a final rush to leave no witnesses. Others were herded into tunnels and gassed. Then, for extra measure, those tunnels were then blown shut. Through this, Shiro Ishii gave an order. All personnel must take this secret to the grave. And then, he disappeared. When Soviet forces finally reached Pingfeng, they found a smoldering shell, scattered equipment, and some records that were left behind in all the chaos. Back in Japan, Ishii and his men went underground. Some changed names, some even managed to slip back into civilian life. But many waited, knowing what's coming next: the Americans. When US forces arrived in Japan, they didn't just find defeated forces. They, in true American fashion, found opportunity. Well, you see, the US was now staring down a new enemy, the Soviet Union. The Cold War was about to begin, and suddenly, the barbaric data collected by Unit 731, the experiments, the plague research, the weapons testing, became very, very valuable. Because of this, American intelligence officers began tracking down Ishii and his team. They wanted everything. How the plague spread, how frostbite killed, how diseases moved through cities. They wanted to weaponize it. Shiro Ishii was never charged with war crimes. Neither were his senior staff. This is because they were protected, so long as they shared what they knew. Some even met with US military officers in Tokyo, behind closed doors. Others were brought to other US-run facilities inside of Japan. It was all off the books. The Soviets, meanwhile, held their own war crimes trials. In 1949, the Soviets charged 12 Japanese officers that were connected to Unit 731. The evidence was overwhelming. But in the West, these trials were viewed as no more than propaganda. This is of course because the US already had its own deal in place, and so the cover-up was sealed. And because of this, Unit 731 never became another Nuremberg. It actually became a secret asset, and the victims, forgotten. Ishii lived out his life in quiet comfort. Some reports say he worked for US biological programs, others claimed he died of throat cancer in the 1950s. But what was certain is this: he was never punished. He never faced a trial. And the data he'd built on thousands of tortured lives was all buried in American archives. As we discussed, justice never came for the victims of Unit 731. For decades, survivors were ignored. They waited and waited for signs of remorse or any recognition, but none ever came. However, after these decades of silence, in Harbin, China, on the very land that such brutal atrocities once took place, they raised a museum. This museum is to serve as a monument not to closure, but to confrontation. The Museum of Evidence of Japanese War Crimes by the Japanese Army, Unit 731, was created because the world refused to listen, and because so many were willing to forget. At the very site of the Pingfeng complex, there are now glass cases displaying instruments that were once used to destroy real human lives. Scalpels, saws, frostbite chambers, organ jars. Yes, it's reported that there's a wall of skulls on display. Hauntingly, some still show saw marks where their flesh was once stripped away. There are photographs of the victims, even children, and the documents that detail these experiments in cold, clinical language. Though nearly no one survived the unit, for the few who did, the museum is so much more than a place of history. For themselves and other victims' families, it was incredibly personal. Here are some of their stories. One story tells of a woman who came to this museum fighting for recognition. Her father had been exposed to plague bombs that were dropped by the Japanese military. She spent years gathering evidence, but no justice ever came. This museum became a part of her efforts to show what so many have tried to deny. Another account tells of a man who was just a boy when his village was sprayed with disease. He lived, but most of his family did not. Years later, he stood before the museum's display cases containing the metal canisters used in that very attack. The reality is, there are many more like them. In some cases, like we discussed, there were entire families or entire communities. Ordinary people who had their lives shattered by torture disguised as progress. Each exhibit is a refusal to forget. Each artifact is an act of resistance against the silence. This museum stands as one of the last witnesses to the horrors that happened within Unit 731. Where official history stays silent, Harbin holds the story within its walls, told by the dead who did not get to know peace, and the living who cannot forget. History only disappears when we let it, and silence helps no one. I'm Autumn Folls, thank you for watching, and I appreciate you being here. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like, and be sure to comment and let me know what you think. If you liked it here and you enjoy discussing dark history like I do, consider subscribing so you can be there for my upcoming uploads. Until next time, take care of each other and never stop asking questions.